Hello, and welcome to Sorry Is This Boring? I'm Marika.
I'm Natalie.
Today we're going to be talking about the film To Die For, from 1995, directed by Gus Van Sant, starring Nicole Kidman, Casey Affleck, Matt Dillon, Joaquin Phoenix, Allison Folland.
It's a dark and stormy Sunday today.
So forgive any sounds of thunder and lightning.
Don't forgive, enjoy.
Yes, enjoy. The film is about Suzanne Stone is a weather reporter at her small town cable station, but she dreams of being a big time news anchor. However, she feels that her middle class husband is holding her back, so she decides to have him murdered. For this, she enlists Jimmy, a high school boy who is enamored with her. The plan doesn't work out exactly as she intended, though, and her husband's family starts to suspect that she was involved in his death.
Spoilers.
Spoilers
Spoiler alert.
ahead. Although the murder is not a spoiler because
Yeah.
it's laid out at the beginning.
Yeah. And also, this film is based off a true crime story. It's inspired by the murder of Greg Smart. The Pamela Smart case, whose Suzanne is based off of, garnered an insane amount of media attention. This case specifically kind of sparked the whole American true crime obsession. And after this, there was the Jeffrey Dahmer case and the O.J. Simpson case. It sort of was the catalyst for America to be sort of enamored with these dark crime stories. She is this woman from Derry, New Hampshire, and she was basically convicted of a conspiracy to commit murder and charged with first-degree murder. So she married this guy, Greg Smart, and they were together for, I think, only around 7 months before they started having marital problems. And she got this job as a media coordinator at a local high school in New Hampshire. And during this sort of thing with this media coordinator job called Project Self-Esteem, she met high school sophomore Billy Flynn, and they started having an affair. She basically conspired with him to kill her husband. The trial was kind of a national phenomenon, and she ended up getting life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the teenage boys that she conspired with in order to murder her husband, they got charged with second-degree murder and were not eligible for parole for 40 years, with 12 years of the minimum sentence deferred if they maintain good behavior. But basically, something that's interesting is that the boys that were involved in the death of Greg Smart have already been released from prison. They got released in March of 2015, but Pamela Smart has life in prison, so she's still there. And it is a story that has been widely used in pop culture. There's books about it. There's been TV episodes.
So, as you just said, this was a very high profile case, and that's something that's reflected in the movie. It's documentary style, and so there's lots of a collage of interviews from different characters, and there's TV show segments that are all in the film to partly tell the story. So I wouldn't say it's like a true mockumentary
Yeah.
in that way because it's got all these real scenes. And as you said, it was adapted into books and TV shows. This script was actually based off of a book by Joyce Maynard, who wrote a novel with the same name, To Die For, that came out in 1992. Joyce Maynard is a fairly well-known writer. She's written a lot of books, including a book in which she details her personal affair with J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye, which I thought was actually really interesting.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so bizarre.
But a theme in her books is sort of domestic conflicts, I would say, and affairs and sort of the scandalous domestic life. But she was from New Hampshire, so obviously this was something that she read about, was quite close to being from New Hampshire, and she made this book, which then was adapted by Buck Henry into a screenplay. Buck Henry is a very well acclaimed screenwriter in Hollywood. His most famous screenplay that he's written would be The Graduate,
Oh, wow.
which
Okay.
is again, like, you can see like common themes of sort of like scandal and affairs and young people and older women. So thought that
Yeah.
that was interesting.
That's
Like
really
it's
bizarre.
really clear to see why he was interested in this case. And then Gus Van Sant is the director. And something that's interesting is this was Gus Van Sant's first film that he made with like a major studio and with a major screenwriter. So it was his sort of first experience because he had gotten a lot of critical acclaim as like an indie filmmaker. And I think that this film, being a dark comedy, is quite different from a lot of Gus Van Sant's other films. It is, not super typical of his work, but then at the same time, I think Gus Van Sant is like very versatile in his work, and I think a lot of that's due to the fact that he's just a veteran filmmaker who's been making films forever, still making films, and he's had worn a lot of different hats in the film industry.
So many hats.
Yeah, I read an interview that described him as an indie figurehead, a new queer cinema hero, a Hollywood pariah, an Oscar nominee, a Hitchcock doppelganger, a Cannes champion, and a Kurt Cobain eulogist.
That's bizarre.
Yeah. So Gus Van Sant was born in 1952 in Louisville, Kentucky. His most known works are Good Will Hunting, Drugstore Cowboy, My Own Private Idaho, and Elephant, as well as just like hundreds more films. Elephant won him the Palme d'Or at Cannes when it was released. And this film was also screened at Cannes when it was released in 1995, which is interesting.
And they're both kind of like based on true crime stories because Elephant is heavily inspired by the Columbine shootings.
Yeah, he's, definitely got an interest in true crime. And also another interesting thing about Gus Van Sant is, like, he's launched a lot of people's careers, really. Like, this film stars Joaquin Phoenix and Casey Affleck, and it was both of their, like, really first big films. Same with Nicole Kidman, it's funny watching it now because she's so, like, famous. But at the time, she was an actress in Australia who was quite well known, but when she came to America, she was known as Tom Cruise's wife. And she had sort of roles in like Batman, and so she was really excited to be in this film because it was like a complex character, and she like wanted to be a serious actor. And she talks about this film, like they all talk about this film, like working with Gus Van Sant as like really like giving them the direction that they wanted to take in Hollywood, because I think partly because he's sort of an indie filmmaker and he likes to make cutting edge things. He doesn't work in the way a lot of Hollywood directors would work. Like, he likes to rehearse, and like he's open to experimentation, and everyone talks about this film as it feeling like a family, like,
That's
and
beautiful.
that people would like hang out and play pool, and they would rehearse, and they would be able to try things, and Gus Van Sant would be like, if you want to like get up and smoke a cigarette in this scene, if it feels right, then do it, So I thought that was really interesting. Another interesting thing about Gus Van Sant is he's done a lot of music videos for like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He's like a big Red Hot Chili Peppers fan, and Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers actually makes cameos on like lots of his films.
Pretty sick.
Another person who makes a cameo in To Die For is David Cronenberg, because this film was shot in Toronto, and David Cronenberg is like a Torontonian filmmaker, and so he plays a cameo in the film as Man at the Lake, which I thought was really cute. Oh, this film is also scored by Danny Elfman, who's someone that Gus Van Sant loves working with. And something that's interesting that I read is that when this film was being sort of screen tested, like the studio was testing the edits, it was like getting really low points from all the test screenings. And Danny Elfman was saying to Gus Van Sant, he was like, Tim Burton's films always get low points, so I think it's a good thing. But that's something that was interesting that I read about, is there was sort of like a big struggle with the studio after this film was made, they actually like made them re-edit it for a whole year, like switching around stuff. And even though Gus Van Sant ended up being like more happy with the result that they got, he said it was just like this huge struggle because the studio kept making them do these test screenings to see how like it tested with audiences, but they were really like rigged and biased, and like people would go and think he was a romantic comedy and then be like, I don't like it at all. And they kept making them make changes purely based on the test scores, which he thought was just a load of bullshit.
Cool.
Yeah. And in an interview with Gus Van Sant, he says, we edited it for about a year. They kept saying, just make it better. They didn't ask us to change it into a romantic comedy, but we wound up changing it quite a bit. Eventually, we changed the way the whole film was put together because we ran out of other things to do. We changed the order of Buck Henry's script. So yeah, that was interesting. Just like hearing about a sort of struggle with the studio, and there was like a points where they were like going to the head of Sony and like fighting for them. And one thing that was interesting is he talked about one good thing about making a major picture like for a major studio is that you can create sort of a political rally around your choices to like convince them, and that's something I didn't think about because like I've always thought of as like a filmmaker about like how people always talk about like the influence of producers and business people at big companies. And so I've always been more drawn to indie filmmaking. But one thing he was saying that's interesting is like it can be the same with independent productions too. There's like one guy who's giving you a couple $1,000,000 and they feel like they, should make the decisions. And you can't do the same kind of like political rallying the way you could within a company, which I thought was quite interesting. Yeah. So he spoke a little bit about the film being brought to him. I have another quote. He says, Joyce Maynard wrote a novel about an incident in New Hampshire, the Pamela Smart case, where she seduced a young student and convinced him to kill her husband so they could spend the rest of their lives together, and it turned back on him after he killed the husband. Joyce wrote a somewhat light novel, but it wasn't really a straight-ahead comedy. But then Buck Henry adapted the book, so he really gave it a whole other spin, sort of like a comedy with blackouts, one-liners, and jokes that weren't in the book. So it was an element of Buck Henry who brought us into that realm of comedy. Gus Van Sant talked about like always kind of wanting to do a comedy. Like I read an interview, a joke he said was that he often wanted to do a Dude, Where's My Car 2? Or like do a Judd Apatow film or something. So I feel like it's cool. Just like speaks to his like love of experimentation and trying new things. Originally, the part of Suzanne Stone was offered to Meg Ryan, who turned it down. And Nicole Kidman wasn't actually offered the part. She read the script and then called Gus Van Sant and was like, please let me do this film. And she spoke to him on the phone for like a couple hours, and then he gave her the part, like just off of that phone call. And I think it's really interesting because I feel like there's kind of like strange parallels between Suzanne Stone and Nicole Kidman.
Oh, yeah.
I have a quote from her from an interview when this film came out, which is really interesting. She says, it was like in regards to being married to Tom Cruise, who like at the time, 1995, was just like a huge superstar, and she really was just known as his wife. Mm-hmm. And she'd also like not been in America at this long at this point, because she'd been sort of well known in Australia, but then moved here. And she says, I don't think that being married to somebody you're in love with is a burden, says Kidman, who's been dismissed in some quarters as more of the superstar's wife than an actress. In the sense of being judged in a certain way, yeah, I was put into a particular mold, but to die for is starting to change that, and that's great. For me, it's a relief. Later, much later, obviously since her very public divorce from Tom Cruise and his, going mad and all that stuff, she like talked about how after she married him, she just worked so much less and she only got terrible parts, and she just sort of started to think like, is this what it's going to be like being an actress in America? And working with Gus Van Sant renewed her faith in that. And I think there's like a lot of parallels because at the time she was like really she was unhappy and wanted to be this thing and was in this marriage that was holding her back. And that's something that Suzanne Stone in the film is totally dealing with. She's just like this driven person. Like she takes a lot of matters into her own hands in very bad ways, but there is like the element of he does hold her back. Like he says, at certain points, he's like, this isn't going to lead to anything. You should just come and work for me at the restaurant and stuff like that. But yeah, Nicole Kidman was really excited to have this role because of the complexity, and a lot of people said that she should have she was robbed of an Oscar nomination for it.
Also, the Oscars are rigged anyways.
That is true. The Oscars are rigged.
It's an old white man's game.
Yeah. But yeah. Yeah, Gus Van Sant was also really drawn to this film because he said it reminded him of his hometown, Darien, Connecticut. But he said he's always been intrigued by the class difference between Italian kids in that community and the waspy daughters of the New York bedroom commuters. He said the tough Italian kids end up dating the blonde IBM president's daughters, and there's this mishmash of backgrounds. So that's like totally something that we have in the film because Suzanne Stone is this blonde waspy bombshell, and then Larry Moretto is this Italian kid from an Italian family who, there's lots of jokes that there are mafia ties. Another interesting thing that I read about Nicole Kidman is that she put like 3.5 months of preparation into this role, and I read that one thing she did was she like checked herself into a Santa Barbara hotel and just for 3 days straight watched reality television.
Oh my God.
To prepare for the role. And she like talked a lot about, really trying to get into the mindset like with no judgment this woman and the idea of moral codes being dictated by television and broadcast media. So that's like something that I think is really interesting about the film. And I do have a quote that I read in a review that came out about the film in 1995, which I think would be a good segue into us talking about it. Suzanne is an insane maniac, and the job she wants is to be a news reporter. And at the same time, these are the people that are telling the rest of us what to think. So I feel like something for me that I liked about the film, like, is that contrast of, like, she's this crazy person who's desperate to be in television, and at the same time, like, even within the story, like, that's what's telling us, what's happening. Another interesting fact. It starts with, clips of Suzanne coming out of a courtroom, and there's, like, news reporters bombarding a funeral, and there's paper clippings about the scandal, like Suzanne Stone. And Joyce Maynard actually plays Suzanne Stone's lawyer in the film. It was like a little cameo, which I thought was cute.
That's cool.
But yeah, so we know pretty much something has happened. Like, if not exactly what. Like, I think it's pretty clear, like, from descriptions that, she's arranged the murder of her husband. And then it goes straight into this interview with Suzanne talking to the camera. The first thing that she says, she's talking about the idea of, like, having this master plan, and you have to look back and see the big picture.
Oh, yeah. That was, like, definitely one of the first things that sort of piqued my interest was just the sort of, the, like, pixel or, like, dots metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Looking close at a printed picture in a newspaper or a digital photograph, and it's all dots, and then when you step back, you see the picture, It's something that's, like, definitely an overused metaphor, which, number one, I feel like definitely goes along with her character, because everything that she says is kind of, like, contrived and taken from things she's heard that, she thinks are really smart and interesting. It kind of sets this precedent for the rest of the film about just how nobody sees the big picture.
Yeah. Except for Suzanne. In a way. Because, like, everything that happens in the film is, in Suzanne's mind, all part of her big master plan to become a successful television journalist.
Yeah.
And right off the bat, she starts, she says these things that are, like, contrived and bizarre. Like, she talks about her husband, and she says he's Italian, and she's, like, interested in those kinds of ethnic relationships as a member of the professional press. Which, like, immediately is just, like, the most bizarre thing to say.
Yeah.
And she's, like, constantly talking about people that she admires, like Laura Polley and these other news presenters. She talks about how she thinks she looks like Laura Polley, but, luckily she doesn't have the weight problem, and she says a lot of things that, like, immediately make you sort of, like, know who she is. You're not meant to like her, but at the same time, she's, like, so magnetic.
I feel like that's just because you love Nicole Kidman.
Maybe that's true.
But I do think it's sort of interesting in, I think she has this sort of way of being and speaking that is kind of understood later within the film when there's this sort of conversation between her and the guy who works at the local news station.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to get her to go home, and she's still editing her video, and he's like, "Oh,
I'd hate to see what happens to the person who says no to you.
yeah, something along the lines of that." And she's like, "No one ever does." And I feel like that's something that sort of explains so much
Mm-hmm.
about her way of being, and it just that, she even talking about having this sort of upper class, like waspy upbringing, and being sort of brought up in this environment of just always being right, always getting away with everything, and
Yeah.
always being put on a pedestal.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting because like everyone in like the start of the film they talk about like she was like the golden blonde and no none of us thought much about it, none of us thought to watch the relationship, and like throughout the film like even the people where she works at the news station they call her gangbusters behind her back, and she's like not at all taken seriously by anybody really except for herself. She like takes herself very seriously, but to everybody else, like she's just this like silly girl with like big dreams. I think like maybe not her parents as much, but pretty much everybody else thinks of her that way. And then there's like her husband who like puts her on this like pedestal. She's like this. He says she's like a porcelain doll. I just want to take care of her.
mm-hmm.
She's perfect, and he's like so proud of like all of her small accomplishments, like she's a child.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that sort of says a lot in the way that just in terms of not really being taken seriously except for sort of her husband for the most part, and then her parents. And I think it's sort of this, I think that's where the naivety sort of comes in
Mm-hmm.
for her character, because I think when you are sort of brought up in this way where you're put on this high pedestal where everybody's telling you, you're gonna do great things and you're so amazing, there's no way you can't achieve anything you want to,
Mm-hmm.
that she's just sort of blindsided by anybody thinking any other way. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah, and it's like the idea as well of like people not taking her seriously, like plays in the idea of like the big picture. Like I think like the reason that nobody sees what she's capable of is because like they don't take her seriously to a degree. Another thing about her that you see quite clearly is that she talks about herself incessantly.
I feel like a lot of the way that she goes about her career and the way that she talks about herself is kind of similar in the way to when you're sort of going through school and there's people who are telling you how to be interviewed
Yeah.
and basically just how to get into the career field, and so much of it is just kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? You know what I'm talking about, right?
It's like about being fake.
Yeah.
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 And it's something that she does like unashamedly and unremorsefully. It's like be fake.
Uh-huh. And so it sort of has this weird kind of dynamic where, she is what everyone it kind of tells you to be and how to get into your career field, but watching it from this distance, you have this sort of objective, like, looking at her in this psychopathic kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just, in a way, it's almost like this weird cycle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And there's like I feel like she definitely like shows that she's some kind of sort of like antisocial personality, just like her lack of empathy in a way. And the way she like conducts herself is like immaculate, and it's very like meticulous and calculated. Even when it's not true, like an early example is like when she's like making dinner for the family and she says like, oh, I made this dish, it's what they serve at Johnny Carson, it's like Johnny Carson's favorite restaurant in Hollywood. And then you find out that she like lied about that, and she got somebody else to make them for her. And it's like the idea of like all that stuff you were saying about how to be successful. She's like doing all these things, but at the same time, it's like she's not successful in her career. You know, she's like very far. Like even when she's working at the news station, she's very far from her dream, and she's sort of adapted to doing things that are actually accessible to her, and like she's like created this like narrative that this is all part of the big plan. And I think a lot of that is like things that aren't accessible to her because like in part she's a woman. I think that's true, you know.
Definitely.
And she can't just like go and be a successful news anchor. She, you know, she's like probably not totally wrong that she like needs a husband for that to happen. And so she like has 100% into being like this perfect wife at a certain point because it's like part of the larger plan. And she like, you know, is going to pretend to be the perfect wife because it's all just like, you know, the next step, and then she can like move on when she gets the job and stuff. And but yeah, she's clearly quite vain as well. Like she talks about always wanting to be this thing, and like this footage of her as a child like watching herself on the television. And, you know, another thing at the dinner party when the sister is talking about this great opportunity in her ice skating career and there might be a television show about it, she's just, like, mad. And you can, like, see it on her face. And then the husband, like, brings it back to be like, oh, but you got a job, too, at the news station. There's also something that I thought was, like, really funny in that scene when he's talking about they have an announcement and it's Suzanne's job at the news station and everyone thinks it's going to be the pregnancy announcement.
Yeah.
And so they're all like, you know, like crying and really happy, and then she's just like, cut, cut, cut. And I thought that was really funny because just that she's like, it's a part of her being entirely. Like most of who she is like the desire to be a television anchor, you know?
Yeah.
And that she even like uses the lingo in her daily life.
And we've like talked about that before with a few other films, using the idea of, you know, your life being a movie or a TV show or something like that to sort of disconnect from reality.
Yeah, and it also makes me think of sort of like the idea again of like these childish obsessions, because like I've definitely like had obsessions with things when I was little, and my family would all just kind of like, you know, humor me. Another thing she says that in the interview at this point is she says, "You're not anyone in America if you're not on TV," and she also says, you know, why do anything if nobody's watching?
That whole idea is just on strange moral ground because I think a lot of people that I know look at the idea of being a good person as not needing validation or some witness for the good things that you do.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's sort of clear on where she is mentally through that statement.
Yeah.
You know.
Then, after sort of this point that's been set up, you know, like we see her husband, her family. So then we meet, through interview style again, Lydia, Jim, and Russell separately, who are also talking about Suzanne. You know, like when we first meet Lydia, she's just talking about how Suzanne was beautiful, and she says, like, she bought me this dress, like, I hope it fits me one day. So I feel like just that, like, opening is so interesting because she's, like, expresses, like, her admiration for this, like, woman who's beautiful, and she's, like, thinks it's amazing that she, like, bought her this gift, but at the same time, like, she's bought her a gift that doesn't fit her, you know?
And the whole time, she places so much importance on her weight.
Yeah.
And puts other people down for their weight. And so it's
Yeah.
just, like, so typical of
Yeah.
her to do that.
Yeah, because appearance is everything to her. And, but I feel like it, you know, sets up this idea of, like, the Lydia relationship is, like, it's this girl that dotes on her, and, you know, like, I feel like, there's an element of Suzanne sort of wanting to make her over in her own image, you know?
And I think, you know, the introduction of these characters and their relationship to her is they come in to her life at this perfect time as they're these people that she sort of needs
Yeah.
in her life. I guess Lydia, in the way that I would sort of compare her to Larry's sister, in the way that Larry's sister does not take any of her bullshit.
Yeah.
Uh, Anytime she says some remark about her appearance,
Yeah, she like
or
rolls her eyes and she laughs.
yeah, and she just doesn't take her seriously. But now she has this sort of person who she can feel superior to,
Yeah.
and who will listen to her and
Mhm.
think that she's really great.
Yeah, I feel like that the big thing that they give her, like all of them, is this idea of taking her seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not only do they give her a purpose and that she's like, I'm gonna make this hit documentary series about kids, but then it's also that they like all think that she's amazing and they take her seriously, whereas like that's not something she's getting from anyone else in her life. You know, like yeah, she's like got the job at the news station, but she doesn't get to do shit. Like she has ideas and they just ignore them all. You
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah. And I also wanted to compare Jimmy to Larry
Mhm.
because I guess on surface level, it's sort of this idea that, you know, we watch throughout the beginning of the film, Larry just sort of worshiping Suzanne.
Mhm.
You know, he's constantly telling people that she's going to be famous, she's going to be on TV, and everyone's going to know her name. And when she finally gets to do the weather report, he makes everyone in the restaurant shut up, you know,
Yeah.
and everything like that. But then there's this sudden shift where he thinks that she should kind of give up on everything
Yeah.
because he wants a family.
Yeah,
And
because like I feel like you know at first she's like this perfect trophy wife who you can show off and be proud of, but then like his wants change, you know, because like it means that she gets the job and now she's not spending much time with him, you know, and like her priority isn't like pleasing her husband and playing the perfect wife and like being like let's have kids. It's the
but
work, and I think
yeah.
like that's when he starts to shift because he's like, wait, I don't want to be here while you're off working and being successful. I want you to be my wife, you know?
But I think as well, it's kind of about what you were talking about before, where she has this sort of master plan,
Mm-hmm.
and the entire time, even with the idea of them going to Florida so she could go to that media conference
Yeah.
and everything, you know, she kind of just sort of dotes him around as this puppy dog,
Yeah.
so she can do the things that she wants to do. But the entire time, she's never really considering that he might have plans, and that's
Yeah.
the reason why the relationship is eventually going to implode on itself.
Yeah, because she's never been concerned about what he wants. It's just that, like, what they wanted aligned for a while, you
Yeah.
know? She
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be Mrs. Moretto. Because, and I was thinking a lot about, like, what the motivations for her wanting to marry him are, other than the obvious of that, like, you know, like, being a wife, like, is something that, like, is sometimes very helpful to succeed as a woman. Being
Mm-hmm.
married to somebody, and also there's, like, the element that this family is, like, very well liked in the community. And, you know, you find out later on, like, they have quite a bit of pull in this community, which I feel like it's something that Suzanne was definitely aware of going into it.
Yeah, that's interesting because that was sort of one thing that I felt like I didn't really understand, especially knowing the real true crime story. It seems to make more sense to me why she married Greg Smart and then why she had an affair with Billy Flynn. The biggest sort of thing is that she was kind of, which is funny because they do talk about it a little bit in the film. It's just the idea of him bringing out this wild side in her.
Mm-hmm.
But they sort of describe Pamela Smart as kind of a wild party type.
Yeah.
And she went to college in Florida, and she was really obsessed with metal music. She had a radio show at her university where she was dubbed the Maiden of Metal.
That's cool.
And Greg Smart was also super into heavy metal, and so that's kind of a big reason why they got together. And they also had a little dog that they actually named Halen after Van Halen.
That's cool.
And the sort of shift was kind of interesting because I do sort of, I'm more interested in the shift that happens in the movie because I feel like it's really sort of realistic to, have this sort of domineering male presence telling a woman to sort of give up on her dreams because they don't align with what he wants, you know? But in the true story, it was sort of, there was this shift where he got a job as an accountant, and he kind of decided to sort of leave behind all of his sort of party lifestyle and become this sort of serious accountant husband. And she really didn't like that because that's not who she married.
Yeah.
And which I do think aligns a little bit, but definitely different. And so she kind of got this interest in Billy Flynn partially because he was kind of a teenage metalhead, and it was like, it sort of allowed her to
relive.
Yeah, keep living out how she wants to live. And I think that that's also really interesting as well in the film, that they are both metalheads, both her husband and James. I guess bringing it all the way back to what I was originally talking about is how they both speak about her really mirror each other.
Yeah.
Larry has this idea that she's so pure, and she's like this China doll, and he just wants to take care of her, and she looks so virginal, basically. And, one of the big things that James says when he's talking about her is that when he's talking about Suzanne to Russell, and he just says she just looks clean.
Yeah.
And that was just a sort of big thing for him.
Yeah, that's like one thing I was thinking about is like there's a scene in the beginning when it's like Nicole Kidman's at the restaurant and, Larry is playing the drums in the band. And there's all these girls that are over them. The sister's talking about how like so many girls were into Larry. And it's just like this sea of like these cool artsy brunette girls. And then it cuts to Nicole Kidman, who's like blonde, super fair, wearing this like little sundress. And like that's what he was drawn to. Because I think like it's so different, and she just like, it's like that. She looks like so clean and pure, and it's like different from like everything in his world. And that's something that I think Jimmy also could see in her, is that she seems like this sort of otherworldly being. And, if you think of her like as a predator, picking men to manipulate and make them do what she wants, she definitely has a type that I feel like she's like figured out, that of men that she can manipulate more easily.
Yeah, definitely.
I really love the scene where we like meet all the three kids together at the same time, because it's just like this like slow-mo shot of them like hanging out on the stoop. And like we already talked about this before, but I just like love how like the film does such a good job at just like making these kids seem like, or at least from my interpretation, making these kids just like seem so innocent because they're just like so naive and vulnerable, and they're so like starved of like attention, I guess, from adults. And they're all just like kind of stupid. Like, not that they're like stupid people, but like a lot of children, like high school kids, are stupid.
Yeah. And especially there's so many kids that just sort of get given up on at such young ages.
Yeah.
And so they don't really get the same opportunities that other kids do, and so that's why they sort of end up seeming really stupid,
Yeah.
And I feel like as well, it kind of mirrors to me, Gus Van Sant's perspective. So, I mean, he's like a baby boomer, but he makes a lot of films that are about young people, teenagers and young adults. And so I think he sort of in turn has this sort of eternal empathy for young people,
Yeah.
especially to have them always be the protagonists in his stories.
Yeah.
Um, and so I feel like that's where I kind of see this sort of difference in River's Edge and To Die For, where, you know, they're both about kind of hopeless, aimless, vulnerable teenagers that are part of Generation X.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of forgotten generation. But I feel like in this case, it gives so much more empathy to sort of their backgrounds and as of like, I don't know. I mean, I think it's similar, but I think a lot of the point of River's Edge is that they're just sort of lost and selfish and don't care about things that they should care about.
Yeah.
And it's sort of looking inward on why, and this one gives them more empathy, I think.
Yeah. And even just that, they're all like clearly kind of like outcasts in a way. And, like when Nicole Kidman comes to school, because she's doing her documentary on the kids, so she like meets with them all, and like they all talk about like them signing up. It was like the most important thing they'd ever done.
Mm-hmm.
It felt so important, and it was like she said to them that you're important, and I want to know what you have to say. And like obviously she was like fully using them for like success, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Like she never once talked about this documentary like really being helpful. It was more like about it being marketable.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's like nobody who'd ever done that for them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Lydia talks about Suzanne as being like her only real friend,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite sad.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing that happens when Suzanne goes to the school is that Russell's character is being like kind of a little shit in the class, like as boys do, like looking up her skirt and like making jokes. And then afterwards, we see like the principal. It's like as if he's hit him or something. He's like on the floor, like holding his face, and the principal's like, "Do you know who she is? That's Suzanne Moretto, married to Larry Moretto, son of whatever Moretto. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're a mafia family, so you like don't want to piss her off or be rude to her, because they'll come after you and kill you."
Yeah, and he calls him like a eunuch or something.
Yeah, he says like they'll make you a eunuch.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll turn you into a eunuch. And so that's why he signs up, because he's been threatened, basically.
But I think as well that sort of just shows how these kids are treated by sort of every
Yeah.
authority figure in their life.
But yeah, it's also like interesting because there's like another scene earlier on when Suzanne's parents are on this talk show and they're talking about how like they were worried that they might be a mafia family when they were talking about them getting married
Mm-hmm.
when they found out, and then like it comes up again, and that's like something that happens in the film. It's sort of like this prejudiced ideas towards the family, but
Yeah, I mean, there's something that is kind of both annoying and funny about it.
I think it's meant to be.
Yeah. I think it's just sort of the ending sort of feels like wish fulfillment in a way. It's just like, oh,
Yeah.
all of these wasps are right about the family, which
Yeah.
really does suck, but it's also really funny in the way that it's sort of a means as to get justice served.
Yeah. But yeah, so like Lydia talks about how like Suzanne bought her like loads of expensive stuff, like ankle bracelets, expensive perfume. And then she talks about how she opened up to her and told her about her mother's like abusive boyfriend, how she once got out the gun and threatened to shoot him with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says something which is sort of like heartbreaking in her interview. She says that she feels like she shouldn't have said that, like maybe she put some ideas in her head.
Yeah.
Which is just like this whole time she's being used, you know, by Suzanne to like whether Suzanne just wants to make herself feel more important or she's like, trying to get more juicy stuff for the documentary. And maybe she does, part of Suzanne really does think she's like helping Lydia by making her like more like her. One part scene I love is sort of it's around this time too, where Larry has the talk where he's like, she gets home late from work, and then he says like, "This is probably isn't gonna go anywhere, Suzanne. Like, I think you should really think about like working at the restaurant with me, and like you can edit some videos of like open mic nights. Like, really think about it." And her like the camera just like it's like an ellipse that just like tunnels in, so it's like all black and just like a little circle around Larry saying these things.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's so good.
yeah, and then she's just like, "Oh well, I'll think about it." Like, yeah. And
Yeah.
I love that moment because I feel like it's I don't know,
Yeah.
surreal, and it's also like portrayed well. Like when someone's telling you something that is just like offending you to your core, and you're just like tunnel visioned on them.
Uh-huh.
But then like her reaction, when she's like, "Oh, yeah, I'll think about it," and like my reaction watching that scene was like, "I can't believe he's saying this. Like it's so mean." But at the same time, it's like definitely like you kind of forget, I think, a bit that like, oh yeah, she's gonna kill her husband. And then I like remember at this point because it's like clear she's decided, like right in this moment, that he needs to die.
Mm-hmm. And even when she just sits down, when he tells her to sit down, and there's that really wide shot of him over at the couch, and it just shows how it feels so distant between them when he's
Yeah.
talking to her, even though it's this really serious, intimate conversation.
Mhm.
It's just so interesting. Something else I thought was kind of sad, like you were saying with Lydia, was when James is talking, he's in his prison jumpsuit and he's talking about where his name came from because Suzanne was the only person to ever call him James.
Yeah.
And he starts talking about how he likes to say that he was named after Jim Morrison, and the sort of reasons why are they're shallow in a way, you know. It's kind of just, you know, he gets to just travel and write and have sex with a bunch of women and just kind of do whatever he wants, and he really admires that. And he just says this thing of, you know, that's the kind of life I always would have liked to have lived. And even though it's really shallow, it's just so sad because you know that
He's in prison.
he's in prison.
Yeah. And you know, like Joaquin Phoenix was actually like 19 when they were making this film, and same with like Casey Affleck. They were like both so young. They like really weren't that far off of like the boys, you know.
Um, I feel like also with Lydia, it was something I sort of talked about with the last episode with River's Edge, where the little brother sort of really idolizes the boy, and there's kind of that's something that's kind of not explored a lot, is a sort of younger, older boy relationship, or just a relationship between two boys where one sort of puts the other one on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
And it is something that's shown a lot with girls, and I feel like this film is definitely one of them, in the way that sort of Lydia doesn't really have any, you know, she hangs out with just a couple of boys at school, and she has a mom, but, you know, her mom seems to be like dating these guys that are probably taking up most of her time, and just letting in more sort of negative male influences into her life. So I think that's another big reason why she's so attached to Suzanne.
Yeah.
Is sort of this one female friend that she can have that seems so cool.
Yeah. And, you know, like she tells, like Lydia talks about the things that Suzanne tells her, like, oh, when I have my show in LA, like, you'll be my personal assistant and all this stuff.
There's a lot of things about sort of Suzanne, not just Suzanne's behavior, but the way that she is viewed that reminds me a lot of The Love Witch.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of this thing that I was kind of talking about with The Love Witch, where I'll try not to spoil anything if anyone hasn't seen it, but the way that she sort of goes about acquiring love is very sort of mechanical and contrived and things like that, but there's very specific people in her life that it works really well on, especially specifically men.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, especially with To Die For, there's this thing where it seems, objectively, it seems kind of clear what her intentions are. And even when the family of Larry is talking about it, because they're sort of distanced from, none of them are going to see Suzanne from the get-go how Larry does, because he's the one that wants to marry her,
Yeah.
and the one that thinks she's really attractive. It's sort of easy to see through her bullshit when you have that sort of objective point of view, but it makes it so much clearer when, Larry and James and Russell, are sort of put under her spell in a way that she kind of she's so good at wearing that mask for these specific people where they're just so blinded by what they think she is and how beautiful she is.
Yeah. I feel like something about the Love Witch is she's just like constantly wearing the mask, kind of. But then with this, like, you see her act with intent, for example, like when she like decided she's gonna seduce James, it's like you see her putting on, just like saying all this bullshit, which like.
But I feel like it is similar in the way because you never really seem to see her crack. You know
That's
what I
true,
mean?
yeah.
And it's kind of similar in the way where, the Love Witch, she'll give a man the potion and then sort of do the striptease and they'll fall in love with her and think she's the greatest thing ever. And then when they get like super obsessed and attached and can't handle it and become emotional messes, she's like, okay, which is kind of what I feel like is a really similar sort of switch flip.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you definitely both don't see either of them crack, but what you do see with Suzanne and you don't see the Love Witch is like the shift of like the direction of this like, performance and how it's changing as like her goals are slightly shifting, like where she goes to each like next step in her supposed master plan,
Yeah, definitely.
One thing that I don't know if this is like jumping ahead, but I want to talk about is when she's having sex with James in the motel room and she's trying to get him to get the gun. Ask Lydia to get the gun.
Yeah.
Because they've already agreed to murder the husband at this point. And she's like sucking his dick and then she like stops and it's like, no, like, don't you see what you have to ask? It's like such like a thin facade at this point because like it's really not needed because she can just like manipulate him so easily at this point and she like literally just like stops sucking his dick to like get him to agree and then she starts again. And it was making me think about like there's like this part at the beginning when she's at the convention. They're on their honeymoon, but she's like snuck off to the convention, to this like news convention, and she meets with this like creepy producer man, who's telling her how this like super famous person whose show that she watches all the time. They don't say the name, but how she got to where she was because she like walked into her job and says, I have like this letter of recommendation, and in it says like she's so good at sucking dick, and then like you find out that she herself wrote that letter pretending it was from like her old boss. And then there's like the scene where she's going in when Suzanne is going into the news station for the job and she has like the letter in her briefcase and she's kind of like bringing it out like hesitantly, but then she like ultimately doesn't. And I feel like that's like the only time in the film where you see her like be like actually like, I don't know, like a moment of like crack is that when she like leaves, she like picks up, like she's like looking at the letter and she like rips it up and she like throws it away because it's like the idea that I guess she's deciding like, is this something like I'm gonna have to do? And she realizes that she didn't need to, maybe, or she's not going to.
Yeah. Yeah,
definitely. And I feel like it's the only time you ever sort of see her doubt or like there's a crack and like she doesn't totally know what she's doing. There is like slight limits to what she like really is like totally fine doing. without making her feel bad about herself.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then like I think like that in contrast with like later when she is literally using sucking his dick to get what she wants
Mm-hmm.
is quite interesting.
I never thought about it that
I
way.
feel like it is like a bit of an arc in a way. Like she does have a transformation, I guess, if you thought about it that way.
Mm-hmm. Something I was thinking about with that scene specifically, which I wanted to talk about something with their sexual relationship, but I wanted to first mention that that scene, it isn't the only scene, but it's definitely one of a few scenes where it feels very much as it is directed by a queer man.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because there's something about the film where I think if it wasn't, there would be so much more sexualization through the lens of Nicole Kidman.
Yeah.
And I don't think there really is that much. I think you see her seducing people, but it's not in a way where it sort of fragments her body
Yeah.
and you see her titties all the time and stuff like that. And I think especially because the real case was so sort of sexually charged,
Mm-hmm.
I think it easily could have been.
Yeah.
And I sort of like that the gaze is more on this teenage boy
Mm-hmm.
than on Nicole Kidman, which it so easily could have been.
Yeah. I think as well, like whenever like she is being sort of like sexualized. Like there's like a scene where they're like trying to look up her skirt, or like someone should be like sitting on a desk provocatively, or like the scene where they're having sex. It's like it is just like always does more feel like sort of like a boyish fantasy when you look at her, and even just
Mm-hmm.
like the way that she dresses so camply all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's sort of more of this ridiculous kind of it's a bit of a draggy idea of what
Mm-hmm.
femininity is, which is something
Yeah.
that I kind of like.
Yeah, like there's a
Um,
scene where it's like Sweet Home Alabama or something is playing, and she's dancing in front of the car in the rain and the headlights, and he's watching her, just
uh-huh.
like completely in love, intensely infatuated. But and like yeah, she's like wearing like like a little sundress, and like Nicole Kidman is beautiful and super attractive, and she's like dancing, but it's like not really like that sexual at all. It's just like
Yeah.
a kind of like a very childish fantasy of sexual,
Uh-huh.
like quite innocent in a way.
But I guess something I kind of wanted to go into was just I think that it is sort of strange their sexual relationship because there is this sort of idea that it doesn't really take too much for her to manipulate this boy. But when he's talking to the cops, when they pretty much find out that he's been involved in this murder, and they're asking about their sexual relationship, and he lists all of the places that they've had sex, which is something that they really didn't show at all in the
Yeah.
film. They show them having sex like twice, and then there's this huge list of all these times when they've had this affair, and it is kind of strange in a way because you have this sort of objective view that she's clearly manipulating him,
Yeah.
but it's almost like she didn't really need to have sex with him that many times to
Yeah.
get what she wanted from him.
No, I think like it's like part of like more just like a depiction of, because like I know in the beginning they do say that she's like wild, and she like has sex, like she would have sex with Larry a lot, like in different places, like she's referred to as wild. And that's like the scene again in their hotel room on their honeymoon where she's like comes in and like starts having sex with him. And I think it's like sort of elements of like antisocial personalities and like psychopathic personalities is being like quite sexual.
Yeah, it's like it's the most base form of desire
Yeah.
that you can use
And like
to
pleasure.
emotionally manipulate
Well, I mean,
people.
just like also like the idea of like like it's just like you get pleasure from sex, like just like carnal desires and like
Yeah.
whenever you want them. I feel like that's something that's like common of psychopathic personalities and antisocial personalities, like
Mm-hmm.
along with like narcissism and lack of empathy, like low sense of morals, and even like the dog that she loves so much. Like that's something that's like also surprisingly common of psychopaths is like having these pets that you like love, because
Yeah.
like more than people, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Definitely.
So I feel like that's just like an aspect of her personality. I think that's what I always equated it to.
And I guess another thing that you were talking about with the idea when they think she's pregnant and she's like cut cut cut, and there's a part near the end when she's either going into the courthouse or leaving it, and there's all this media swarming her, and every time she looks at them, and it's a point of view, it's a subjective camera point of view, you hear an audience cheering.
Yeah.
And I think it just sort of adds to that idea of it just being sort of disconnected from reality in this way. So one thing with Lydia, I feel like she has the biggest sort of character arc. Because, the whole time you hear her talking to the camera, it's from the end of whatever the situation is, because it's sort of this documentary style thing. And and in the beginning, she's talking about how amazing she was. She kind of talks about her in past tense, um, and just how she thought of her in this sort of fantastical kind of way. And one of the biggest things is at the end when she sort of that quote that you talked about where she's sort of like, what's the point of doing anything if nobody's watching you?
Yeah.
And things like that. And she sort of points out the bullshit in that quote.
Yeah.
And I think that she sort of seems to have this arc, this change in, like, view of this person that she put on such a pedestal. And I like that she kind of feels sort of superior to her in the end, and
she says like that's kind of bullshit because if everyone was on TV all the time, then who would be watching? And I love that she says she's like talking about how she's like going on Oprah and all these shows, and then she's like, it's like funny, like turns out that I'm the one that's gonna be famous. Like if Suzanne knew, she would die.
yeah, exactly. And I think it's just really great that she sort of, through this horrible experience, she's able to get this gratification that sort of, Suzanne gave to her and then sort of took away and was like, no, this is bullshit,
Yeah, it's sort of like Suzanne didn't really want to give anything to Lydia, but in the end she did, She's like, Lydia's definitely come out good from this. Like, she's, getting flown to Oprah.
Yeah.
And the very end scene is amazing when
it's great.
the sister who hated Suzanne this whole time just like ice skating on the lake where her dead body is hiding. Which is beautiful. I also love how they use like her own TV like obsession because she's so smart, Suzanne. Even when Lydia's like coming with the wire to try and get her to say something incriminating, she like won't. She does not incriminate herself.
And she pokes her belly.
Yeah.
Right before, and she's like, "Oh, have you been losing weight?" And which is something that would be typical of her to say, but to me it seemed clear that she was kind of like checking for wires.
Yeah. She's very smart, and at the same time, like her sort of like deluded sense of self, like, and her career, like the obsession with television, is her vulnerability, because like that's what they're able to entrap her with, because it seems like an obvious sort of sting to me. He's like, meet me in this weird alley, like with the tape, and you're gonna be, famous in Hollywood, and like come with me, and then they kill her.
I just wanted to say that I think there was something that really nice about sort of showing the vulnerability of the family dealing with this tragic loss, because I think a lot of times when, even if it's sort of a fictionalization of something that, some crime or murder that really happened, there's a lot of problems with sort of romanticization of it.
Yeah.
And especially nowadays. And I think that it's something really nice to see the sort of impact that these kinds of things have
Yeah.
on people's families and friends and stuff like that. And so I felt like it sort of took away that romanticization, because you
Yeah.
could definitely go into it thinking, oh, you know, it's just a true crime.
Yeah. No, what I
story.
loved about it is the film doesn't read as a cautionary tale or like as romantic in any way.
Yeah.
The events.
I agree.
It just is what it is. It's like a slightly sad, like it's a dark comedy, you
Mhm.
know? What do you think was the purpose of the changed ending in the film from the book and the real life story?
I mean, I definitely thought it was sort of interesting to have her kind of get away with it through the court case. One sort of interesting difference between the movie and the true story was that Cecilia, who Lydia is based off of, when she did wear a wire to talk to Pamela Smart, Pamela Smart said a lot of really incriminating information, and those tapes was what got her imprisoned. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of interesting to have them change that so that she would leave the courthouse a free woman, you know?
Yeah.
And there's just no dirt on her. They can't prosecute her for anything. I guess I kind of feel like it's sort of the same thing with a lot of Quentin Tarantino films, where he kind of, a lot of his films have to do with sort of rewriting history in a way that he finds interesting. And I kind of feel like this movie does that as well.
Yeah.
Kind of playing it up as a sort of alternate reality where maybe she doesn't say anything incriminating. She doesn't go to jail for life. You know, it's all on these kids, but then justice is served a different way.
Yeah.
Oh, something I also kind of wanted to say that I forgot about was when I was doing the research about the true crime story, there's been so many people that have interviewed Pamela Smart in jail, and there's tons of articles that are more about her perspective. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to stay away from that because there's a lot of things that have led to her imprisonment that she denies to this day. And so I didn't want, you know, the sort of fact of the trial to be muddled by that. But something that I did hear her say that I thought was really interesting was that she was talking about how when this case garnered so much media attention, every fucking newspaper and, you know, report was talking about her appearance and things that she would wear to the courtroom. It was never just Pamela Smart was in the courtroom today. It was always what size heels she was wearing and how she was doing her hair.
Yeah.
And the kind of suit that she was wearing. And she always thought that was really ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And it's something I found really interesting. And I think that, you know, her character has changed a lot in this sort of fictionalization, but I think that the way that she sort of viewed and treated from a sort of more feminist point of view, I guess, is really interesting.
Yeah.
You know, I don't really think she's innocent. I do, from what I've read, and from the tapes that I read, it sounds like she knew about it and she was conspiring.
Yeah.
So.
But I see what your point is, like there's like a larger issue just like of the treatment of women in the media, you know, who commit crimes.
Yeah.
And
yeah, they didn't, when Jeffrey Dahmer was garnering media attention, they weren't like, oh,
he's wearing pants from Banana Republic today.
Yeah.
Yeah, but especially like a woman who seduced younger people, like there's a lot of cases like that in the news that like I've heard about over time, and it's like the idea, you know, it's like again, the patriarchy painting women as monstrous feminines.
Yeah.
And like in this case, like I do think she is kind of a monster to a degree. I mean, obviously she's a real human who's like got a lot of her own issues to have led her to make the choices she made, but you know,
But she did something that, is wrong, is
yeah,
bad. We don't agree with.
yeah.
Um,
I think like talking about like the idea of changing the ending, like something that I when you were talking about all the stuff, but like the media was like, all the newspapers giving this attention. If that's something that they'd put in the movie, it would be like giving her exactly what she wanted. Like
mhm.
even though she would be in prison, she would still be getting all the attention she wanted.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
so I feel like I like the idea of like taking that away from her.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so my question was, what was one thing you liked that was changed from the real story, and one thing that you wish was added to the movie from the real story?
Well, I guess like the thing that I liked that was changed was just like Nicole Kidman character, um, as being just like I don't think that Pamela Smart was like a crazy like driven aspiring news person, and I really like that element of it because it's like I feel like it contrasts really well with the idea of like being told the story through media.
Mhm.
I liked her character a lot because even though she is like not a good person in any way, it is still just like cool to see like badass driven women like getting what they want. I think so.
Yeah.
That's like one thing I like that they changed. Okay, so one thing I wish they would have added that took place in the real story that you mentioned to me was that when they were going to commit the murder, there was a third boy, because in real life they were underage, and so they got this third boy to drive them. And while they parked at the mall and were going to walk to the house, but while they were waiting for the right time to go over and commit the murder, they just ate pizza and hung out at the mall and went to a music store. And yeah, that would be a good scene for sure to see.
Oh, show.
Some young Joaquin
Eating
bumming,
za.
eating some za, bumming around the mall. Who wouldn't want to see that?
True.
Anyway, my next question is what do you think motivates Suzanne to marry Larry in the first place and then also want to kill him as opposed to just getting divorced or saying something else, you know?
Mhm. That is definitely sort of a confusing idea because she actually kind of says the same thing that Pamela Smart said, where she kind of only tells this boy that, if they divorced, then he would get everything, which, we don't know how true that is. And even the dog was a factor, that he would get the dog, and it's kind of this weird thing where
Seems like a fake excuse.
yeah,
Yeah.
but at the same time there's not really anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe because especially, Suzanne is portrayed as this uh just really vapid, materialistic kind of person. And even Pamela Smart, there was something I read where it said that the reason that she wanted them to use a gun instead of a knife was so that they wouldn't get blood on her white leather furniture. And so I kind of feel like, maybe it is just a sort of vapid reason, maybe she just does, marriage is like a really confusing thing, and sometimes you can just lose all of your belongings through divorce, and maybe that's just something that's like sort of, she likes where she's living, and, you know, the only thing she wants to change is her husband, which, might not work out as planned if she just divorced him.
Yeah. I
And
just
it could be money too, she could
yeah.
just get all of his money. I feel like this is also something that I feel like I kind of talked about, but I would like to hear your opinion. Do you think anything from the story was sort of enhanced by having it be from this queer perspective?
I think like 100%. Like something that I love about Gus Van Sant's films is that, like Elephant, for example, was one of like the first Gus Van Sant films I saw. It's based off of Columbine, like you were saying, and it just is like this look at it, which is like probably like very controversial because it's not like these are the villains, these are the victims, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
he definitely loves to cover things that are sort of very in the media or like well-known stories in a way, sort of like novelizations of these like well-known things, but not, do it in such a way where it's like there's this person who did this bad thing and like these kids, like they did shoot her husband and they did go to jail. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that feel bad for them, but like there's probably just as many people that think that they're just like shitty, awful kids that deserve to be in prison for even longer, you know?
Definitely.
And so I think that that's just something that he tries to create with everything. Is like identifying with the outsiders and
Mm-hmm.
taking a look at things like objectively some from like a upside down way to try and explore things from like other angles. And I feel like that's something that's like innately queer, obviously.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, my last question is, what was your favorite scene in the film?
I think one of them is when she comes back to her house and there's all the police and detectives there. And there's a bunch of media standing outside her house and all the family is inside. And the sort of news reports or whatever have ended and in the dead channel there's sort of the national anthem playing and an American flag, and she walks out of the house and they're like, you don't have to talk to the media if you don't want to, but knowing her character at this point, she's probably going to.
Yeah.
And you just hear the national anthem playing as she's like walking out to meet with the media, and I think that's fabulous.
Yeah. It's like all of the parents are sitting on the couch and then it like shows like the detective like dusting the screen for like prints or something or like getting some kind of sample off of the television screen. And in my mind was just like, if this was like a crime scene they're still gathering evidence from, like why did they let all these people come and like trample through it? Like why did they call them all and be like come over, but then still like actively gathering evidence? I don't know.
I don't know.
I mean,
I
I don't
mean,
know how crime scenes work, but it seems
no, that's a
strange.
good point because I would think the same way. But when I was looking up the stuff about the the real crime, um, they were talking about that one of the first things for them to be like, oh, maybe she's a suspect in this crime was she was walking through the house with the detectives, and um, they said that she seemed kind of emotionless, and she like stepped into the puddle of blood to like go downstairs to grab her dog because they actually locked her dog in the basement so we wouldn't have to like deal with all the commotion.
Yeah.
And so she just, like stepped over this puddle of blood to get the dog, and they
Yeah.
were just like, that's suspicious.
Yeah.
What was I gonna say? Oh, and then another one of my favorite scenes is honestly when Joaquin Phoenix is like laying on his couch and he's watching Suzanne doing the weather report, and he's just touching himself, and there's this whole sort of fantasy of her speaking to him in the weather report,
Yeah.
and it's just really hilarious. And then also Joaquin Phoenix dancing is fire.
Yeah.
It's one of the greatest things to happen to cinema.
Yes. The dancing scene is one of my favorites.
Yes. Is there any sort of characterization of Suzanne that you think would have been just as successful? Because, it was sort of changed into that character for the fictionalization of it, and I know that you really like that character, but I'm just wondering if there's any other sort of characterization of her that you think would have still worked within the story.
I don't know, because I feel like I can't imagine another, like, because, like, the characterization of Suzanne gives her motivation for everything she does. That's, like, it's not like agreeable, but it's understandable, you know?
Mhm.
Like her motives are quite clear all the time. And I can't imagine like a characterization where like her motivations would be like not somehow emotional, you know? Because I feel like in the real life story, like a lot of it was emotionally motivated. That she was like unhappy with her husband,
Mhm.
and she like had yearned for things that she like found in this boy. That's like what I take from it, and
Yeah.
you know, like that's like harder to understand because it's internal and it's like personal. But with this one, this characterization of her, it's it's like so factually motivated because we know that she has this goal and there's like obstacles that come up along, and even though it's like ridiculous, but like it does make sense. You can see why it makes sense in her mind, you
Mhm.
know? I feel like, I don't know, another way that they could have done it. Did you want to give your recommendations?
Sure. So two films. I have two this time. Two films I would recommend if you really liked To Die For is number one, Serial Mom. Yeah, it's a film by John Waters, and it's just about, you know, this suburban mother that also has, you know, serious serious anger issues, and she's sort of, it's a total black comedy, and it's, you know, anyone that sort of crosses her path in her perfect suburban world she gets rid of, and it also has a lot to do with sort of media coverage of it,
Yeah.
and just her getting away with things, and she's such this anti-hero of the story, you
Yeah.
know, where she's like fabulously tragic, and yeah, I think it's very similar in that way of sort of camp, and then another film I would recommend is Natural Born Killers. It's a film that's, you know, it's probably based off of some real life couple killers and things like that, but it's sort of a very Bonnie and Clyde esque story where it's, you know, this couple from really broken households, and they decide to go on this cross country murder spree, and it's a love story, but it's also a lot about sort of how the media portrays them, and it is really dark. Like, I would, if you're not really into violence, you know, I feel like To Die For is very tame in terms of violence, so it is a really, really violent film, but it does cover a lot of these ideas of sort of sensationalism, and there's characters, not characters, but there's people in the movie who become infatuated with the couple Mickey and Mallory, and they become sort of celebrity icons. And I think that's sort of something that was explored a lot within the 90s, is sort of the idea of romanticization, idolization of criminals and of celebrities,
Mm-hmm.
and so it does a really good job of exploring that while also really humanizing these criminals. Well, thanks for tuning in to Sorry Is This Boring. I'm Natalie.
I'm Marika.
Uh,
Catch you on the flip side.